Chapter 1. The Breach Below. The first sign was not the screaming. It was the dust. It came trickling down from the ceiling of the old lower gallery in pale threads, powdering helms, beard rings, lantern tops, and the hunched shoulders of the miners working the abandoned vent road beneath Karak Dromzul. The gallery was an ugly place, old even by dwarf reckoning, cut in a harsher age when function had mattered more than pride. The ceiling was low, the stone black with soot from centuries of smoke breath and forge reek, the supports thick as giants' thighs and scarred by old tool marks. Iron pipes clung to the walls like the ribs of some buried beast, carrying steam and stale heat from deeper pumps. The air tasted of oil, old ash, and the cold mineral stink of water seeping through rock. Harjan One Eye looked up first. He spat into his beard and held the lantern higher. "Feel that," he muttered. The others had already felt it. The floor was trembling under their boots in a way no mind should. Not the honest shudder of picks biting stone, not the sluggish groan of settling masonry. This was a rapid, skittering vibration, as though something huge and frantic was scratching at the bones of the mountain. Then came the tapping, 1,000 tiny impacts from the far wall. Tick, tick, tick. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Every man in the gallery went still. The tapping became a drumming. Iron bolts quivered in their sockets. Dust came down harder. A rusted valve wheel spun half a turn by itself with a shriek like an animal. Somewhere in the dark behind the wall something chittered, and the sound slid through stone in a way sound should not, thin and wet and eager. Huggins swore. "Back!" he snapped. "Back from the wall!" They were too slow. The stone burst inward in a spray of shattered slate and powdered granite. The first miner vanished in the blast of debris, his skull broken open by a spinning chunk of rock before he even had time to cry out. A second was hurled onto his back beneath a rain of splinters. Then the dark in the hole moved, and the dark had teeth. Skaven boiled through the breach in a knot of filthy fur and rusted iron. They came low and fast, yellow fangs bared, pink tails lashing, their red eyes bright with a hunger so vicious it barely seemed sane. They wore scraps of leather, mail made of blackened rings, stolen bits of plate hammered to fit narrow shoulders. Their smell hit a heartbeat later. Rot, hot musk, old blood, sewage, and something chemical and wrong that stung the back of the throat. One of them landed on Hagen's chest with a screech, and drove a chipped blade under his beard and up through the floor of his mouth. The point punched out through the top of his head in a spray of blood and teeth. He kicked once, hard enough to rattle the lantern in his fist, and the Skaven wrenched the blade free, painting the wall behind it red. That was when the screaming started. It filled the gallery, dwarf voices booming in rage and terror, shrill Skaven squeals cutting through them. Miners snatched up picks and shovels and lamp hooks because there was no time for anything else. A broad old delver named Corey smashed his mattock through a ratman's jaw, splitting its face in a burst of black blood and broken incisors. Another Skaven leapt onto his back, clawing at his eyes, while a third opened his belly with 3 fast stabs. Corey sagged to his knees, both hands trying stupidly to hold his guts in as the steaming ropes of them spilled between his fingers. The gallery became a slaughter pen in a breath. Further down the tunnel, Engineer Brocky Hallgrimson heard the first echo of it over the clanking labor of the old pump line. He straightened from the open housing of a pressure regulator, wrench in one hand, lantern in the other, and listened. Brocky was broad even for a dwarf, with a black beard braided close for work, and a face seamed by old burns where boilers had spat and powder had flashed. Brass spectacles sat low on his nose. There was grease on his gauntlets and soot ground into the lines of his palms. He had spent the better part of 3 days in the lower works, cursing seized valves, patching rotten rivets, and writing increasingly rude maintenance reports for a council that never read them. The scream came again. Then the unmistakable din of panic and steel. His eyes hardened. "That'll be trouble," he said to no one. He snatched up his satchel, shoved the regulator hatch shut with his boot, and ran. The old vent road bent twice before opening into the miners' gallery, and Brocky knew it was bad before he reached it. The air was wrong. It carried fresh dust, blood heat, and the skittering manic racket of too many feet. He rounded the corner and almost ran into a fleeing miner slick with gore. "Skaven!" the miner bellowed, eyes rolling white in the lantern glow. "By Grungni, they're in the wall!" Behind him the passage vomited out survivors, limping, shrieking, swinging tools wild at shadows. Something small and furred shot after them and brought one down by the calf, teeth punching through leather and flesh. The miner collapsed with a yell as the Skaven climbed him, stabbing into his back again and again so fast the blows blurred. Brocky drew his pistol, fired once, and blew the rat-man's head apart in a burst of bone shards and black-red matter that splashed across the stone. "Seal ranks!" he roared. "Form on me, you empty-headed tunnel goats. Form!" But they were miners, not soldiers, and fear had them by the throat. Then the deep horns sounded, once, twice, 3 times. Not a muster call, not a fire bell. Breach below. The note rolled through the stone like iron thunder, and with it came the answering stomp of disciplined boots from the adjoining corridor. Brocky turned as Dorna Cragsdottir and her ironbreakers came on at a run, shields up, helms lamp-eyed and grim beneath the soot-stained runes on their plates. They filled the width of the passage like a moving wall of iron and hard intent. Their armor was old, thick and beautifully ugly, built for exactly this place, shield rim against shield rim, axe heads hooked and ready, no wasted motion. Dorna led from the center, face hidden behind the barred visor of her helm. Only her eyes showed, pale and unblinking. "Report!" she snapped. "Hole in the gallery wall," Brocky said. "Skaven, scores of them at least. Fresh breach, more coming. Then we kill the first scores before the next arrive." No speech, no flourish, just that. She planted her boots. Her shield slammed forward. The ironbreakers locked into a line across the tunnel mouth, while behind them the second rank lowered axes over the shoulders of the first. "Hold!" Dorna barked. The Skaven came screaming around the bend in a tide of fur and blades. They hit the shield wall with a sound like wet meat thrown at a gate. Spears jabbed. Rusted swords screeched across iron. One ratman scrambled up the front of a shield, claws scritching for purchase, until an ironbreaker split it from groin to breastbone with an upward axe cut. The creature spilled open in a steaming mess, entrails slapping across the shield face, before sliding to the floor. Another Skaven thrust a hooked blade through the vision gap of a miner cowering behind the line and ripped sideways. The miner's cheek and one eye came away in a red, ragged ruin. He collapsed, screaming, hands pressed to a face that no longer held together properly. The ironbreakers did not move. Axes rose and fell in brutally economical arcs. A rat man lost an arm at the shoulder and shrieked as black blood pumped over the stones. Another took an axe into the collar and had its neck half severed, head lolling at a monstrous angle, while it still scratched at the shield in front of it. The front rank of Skaven died in heaps, but the ones behind climbed over the corpses with rabid energy, trampling their own wounded under clawed feet. Brocky fired his second pistol shot into a narrow snout and drew his engineer's hammer. He smashed the square head into a ratman's temple hard enough to cave the skull. The impact numbed his wrist. The creature dropped twitching, jaw still snapping on reflex. Another sprang for him from the side tunnel, and he caught it under the ribs with the point of a wrench, pinning it to the wall. It writhed, squealing, paws clawing at his beard, until he shoved it off and stamped its knee backward with a crunch. "Message to the upper halls!" he shouted over the din. "Tell the Thane the lower workings are breached. Powder, reinforcements, and authority to collapse the old junctions." A runner went, ducking low behind shields and sprinting into the dark. The fighting thickened. Skaven hurled themselves at the line in bursts, then flowed back, then surged again, their leaders shrieking from behind in a language like rusted hinges and diseased lungs. Slings cracked, stones and bits of scrap iron hammered against helms. One missile struck an ironbreaker in the mouth, slit, and punched his teeth down his throat. He staggered, choking blood, and two Skaven instantly thrust through the gap beneath his arm. Their blades went into the softer joins of his armor, under the pauldron, into the armpit, up under the gorget. He made a sound like a smith's bellows giving out, and went to one knee. Dorna stepped into the gap before the body hit the floor. Her axe sheared through one Skaven's wrist, then buried itself in the second's face. She kicked the first into the wall so hard its spine cracked. The dead ironbreaker was dragged back by his heels, leaving a broad smear of blood and leaked organs where the armor had been opened. "Closer!" Dorna roared. "Make them choke on us!" The line advanced one step. For a heartbeat, it worked. The Skaven gave ground, hissing. Then the wall behind them glowed green. Brocky saw it first through the melee, a nauseating emerald shimmer throbbing deeper in the breach, too bright and too alive to be honest flame. The hair on his arms prickled under leather. A bitter metal stink flooded the air. "Down!" he bellowed. "Down, you fools!" Too late. Warp fire hit the tunnel in a shrieking stream. It was not like natural fire. It moved with intent, a liquid lash of green-white incandescence that painted the stone with crawling light. It struck the front rank and turned the world into a furnace. Iron ran red. Beard hair flashed to ash. Flesh did not simply burn. It burst, blackened, split and sloughed off in gobbets as the unnatural heat boiled blood inside armor. One ironbreaker vanished inside his own glowing plate as if smelted alive, his scream cut short when his visor melted inward across his face. Another flailed with both gauntlets fused to his shield, skin peeling from his forearms in curling strips. The blast splashed across the tunnel wall and sent miners staggering back with their clothes ablaze. One man ran 6 blind steps before his boot hit a corpse, and he went down. The skin of his cheek had come off in a single hanging flap. His exposed teeth showed through the muscle as he tried to scream. A Skaven pounced on him through the smoke and bit into the softened meat of his throat. Brocky slammed himself behind a support pillar as the edge of the warp fire washed past. Heat knifed through him, blistering the side of his neck. He smelled burned beard and heard men cooking alive in their armor. When the stream gutted out the tunnel, was a vision from a drunkard's nightmare. Stone sweating from the heat, corpses still twitching in green-edged flame, molten rivulets of iron from half-slumped shields, the air thick with greasy smoke, and the sweet charnel stink of roasted flesh. The Skaven shrieked with delight and came on through it. Dorna emerged from the smoke, blackened but standing, her shield a slagged ruin, one side of her helm glowing dull red. She had lost half the crest from the heat. She buried her axe in the first ratman to reach her, and used its collapsing body as a barrier while the others reformed around her. "Back to the valve chamber!" she barked. "Fighting withdrawal. Move." They gave ground by feet, not yards, dragging wounded, shoving the able-bodied into shape as they retreated through blood-slick stone. The Skaven nipped at them the whole way, darting into stab, scampering back before the answering chop of an axe. Brocky seized a brass inspection lamp from the wall and hurled it into a knot of them. It burst, oil flashing hot. 3 ratmen went down squealing, fur afire, clawing at themselves as their skin crackled. At the junction by the old pump room, the defenders turned and made a stand around a waist-high barricade of tool crates and broken pipe. Miners who could still stand were given hammers and told to use them until their hands stopped working. A wounded ironbreaker sat against the wall trying to push loops of his own intestine back beneath his cuirass, while another tightened his bandages for him with a face like carved stone. Above them, somewhere beyond hundreds of yards of carved halls and ancestral chambers, the council would be arguing already. Brocky knew them. They would ask how bad it was, whether the reports were exaggerated, whether sealing the lower levels endangered supply lines, whether old laws permitted the flooding of the abandoned workings without a full muster, whether guild negligence had caused the breach, whether this was in truth a mere raid and not an incursion. They would weigh pride against procedure, while dwarfs bled into the cracks below. He wiped soot and blood from one lens of his spectacles and peered into the dark. The scratching had not stopped. It came from ahead, behind, to the sides, through the stone, through the floor, through the very bones of Karak Dromzul. Not one tunnel, many. A truth colder than fear settled in his gut. "This wasn't chance," he muttered. Dorna heard him. "No. They're driving for something." The ironbreaker captain looked past him, toward the upward shafts, toward the heart of the hold, where the lifts rose to the barracks, the foundries, the ancestral halls, and the council chambers where old fools sat under carved kings and wasted time. "Yes," she said, "they are." As if to answer, a new sound rolled through the lower dark. Not feet, not claws, machinery. A grinding, howling, metal-chewing snarl that bit into stone with hideous appetite. Dust fell again from the ceiling, heavier than before. The walls trembled. Somewhere, in the black behind the Skaven front, something vast and engineered was gnawing its way deeper into the mountain. A miner began to pray under his breath. Brocky opened his satchel and took out a bundle of blasting charges wrapped in oilcloth. He set them beside him with slow, deliberate care. The Skaven came boiling out of the smoke once more, their eyes fever-bright, blades up, their chittering voices joined by the obscene mechanical shriek from beneath the earth. And in the deep places of Karak Dromzul, where old stone remembered every oath and every death, the battle for the hold truly began. Chapter 2. Room to Room. The barricade did not break all at once. It came apart by inches, the way all doomed things did in war. A split plank here, a burst rivet there, a crate knocked aside by dead weight and frantic claws. Each impact sent a shudder through the stacked tool chests, and lengths of pipe Brokey and the survivors had thrown together across the mouth of the valve chamber. The old pump room behind them sweated steam from cracked fittings. Condensation dripped from the ceiling in fat, oily drops that fell hissing onto blood-wet stone. The air was a choking broth of coal soot, hot metal, burnt fur, voided bowels, and the copper stink of opened bodies. Skaven skittered over the corpses of their own dead and slammed into the barricade in a shrieking, clawing mass. Rusted spearheads jabbed through gaps, hooked blades hacked at planks, thin pink tails whipped and coiled in the crush. Their eyes shone like embers in the smoky dark, fever-bright and utterly hateful. They were not soldiers in any dwarf sense. They were a vermin tied with knives, driven by terror from behind and hunger from within. The dwarfs met them with iron. Dorna, Crag's daughter, held the center of the line, boots planted in pooled blood, blackened helm dented and scorched from the warp fire blast. The right side of her beard had burned away to a crisp fringe beneath the gorget. Her shield was gone, slagged almost to uselessness in the corridor fight, so she had taken a heavy pump valve wheel from the wall and gripped it in her left hand like a crude buckler. In her right, she worked her axe with the hard, joyless economy of a butcher. A spear punched through the gap above the crate line toward her throat. She trapped it against the valve wheel, yanked the shaft forward, and dragged the snarling Skaven face first into reach. Her axe fell. The rat's skull split from brow to snout with a sound like green wood cracking. One eye burst. Teeth sprayed from the ruin of the muzzle. She kicked the corpse loose, and another was instantly there. To her left, Ironbreaker Harrick Mudderson took a hooked blade through the cheek. The point punched in under his eye and tore a wet red furrow as it ripped out. He roared through a mouthful of blood, caught the Skaven wrist, and hauled the creature half over the barricade. Its hind legs scrabbled wildly against the crate, while he buried his dagger again and again into the rat's throat, until the blade grated on spine. Black blood sheeted over his gauntlet. He shoved the body down, and another Skaven leapt into its place, paws pattering on the dead as if flesh were just another floor. Behind the front rank, Brokey crouched beside the ruptured regulator manifold and worked with shaking but deliberate hands. He had a wrench between his teeth, a coil of fuse cord looped around one wrist, and 3 squat blasting charges nestled in an open powder satchel at his knees. His face shone with sweat under the soot, one side blistered angry red where the warp fire had kissed him in the first fight. He ignored the pain. There was no room for pain, only measures, angles, distances. "Va, turn that wheel when I say," he snapped. A miner with half a beard and a split scalp braced himself on the corroded steam valve and nodded, though his eyes kept dragging toward the barricade where his brother's corpse was wedged under a broken plank and being eaten by tugging Skaven jaws. Brokey shoved a charge into the cracked joint at the base of the pressure tank and tamped it in with oily rags. "Dorna," he barked, 10 heartbeats, and get your lot down." "Take 5, she called back without looking. A Skaven sling stone ricocheted off the wall and split a miner's ear into ribbons. The man cried out. Another stone hit him in the teeth and sent 3 of them spinning across the floor. He bent over, gagging blood, and Dorna shoved him upright with her shoulder. "Stand or die, useless," she snarled. The barricade sagged inward. A knot of clan rats squeezed through. and the line ceased being a line. It became a melee. A Skaven sprang atop the crates and launched itself at Brocky, knife first. He rose from his crouch with the engineer's hammer already swinging. The square iron head connected under the creature's jaw and turned its face into a flattened ruin. Bone gave way. The body cartwheeled sideways, hit the floor, and thrashed in a puddle of its own blood. Another was already slithering over the barrier. Brocky caught its snout in his left hand, thumb jammed into one eye, and drove his wrench into the side of its neck until the tool vanished almost to the handle. "Now," he roared. The miner on the wheel threw his weight into it. Ancient pipework screamed. A second later, a shrieking jet of superheated steam burst from the ruptured manifold and blasted through the center of the chamber. White vapor exploded outward, filling the room in a cloud thick as wool. The closest Skaven vanished inside it and came out dying. Their fur slicked flat, skin sloughed from their paws in pale sheets. One rat-man stumbled blind into the barricade, with the flesh of its face hanging loose and translucent from the skull, jaw opening and closing through boiled lips as it tried to scream. The dwarfs fell back through the side door as Brocky touched his fuse to the lantern flame. The blast hit with a deep-bellied cough that punched the breath. From the corridor, stone dust gazed through the doorway. The pressure tank burst like a struck egg. Iron fragments screamed through steam and dark. A jagged shard the size of a hand took a Skaven through the chest and burst from its spine. Another piece clipped a dwarf miner behind the knee and removed the lower half of his leg so cleanly that for a heartbeat he stood on the fountain of his own blood before he pitched over. "Move," Dorna thundered. They retreated through the old maintenance passage in a limping, brutal knot, dragging wounded by belts and harness rings. Steam boiled after them. Brocky risked a glance back and saw the pump room half collapsed. The barricade gone, the chamber choked with writhing bodies. For a fleeting breath he allowed himself the hope they had bought space. Then he heard the chittering begin again behind the settling dust. "Not enough dead." Never enough. The maintenance passage bent sharply and narrowed until even dwarfs had to turn their shoulders to move fast. Tool alcoves punctured the walls. Old rune plates hung crooked where generations of leaking vapors had corroded their fastenings. Water ran in black threads along the floor channel, carrying ash, clots of blood, and one severed Skaven ear. Further up, the passage opened into a grain vault, carved straight from the mountain. Great stone bins lined the chamber, their lower hatches banded in iron. In peacetime the place smelled of dry meal and stored wealth. Now sacks had burst under hurried feet, and the floor was carpeted in pale grain that had gone pink and sticky, where the retreating dwarfs had bled into it. "Here," Dorna said. "Form in the hatch lane." The survivors dropped into place with the weary obedience of the half-dead. They were fewer now. 2 ironbreakers gone from the first stand, another limping, another with one arm hanging useless where a blade had slipped into the elbow joint. The miners looked like men dug up from a battlefield. Scorched, grey with dust, hair singed, eyes filmed with shock. One youth could not stop trembling. He gripped a shovel like it was a prayer and not a tool. Brocky strode to the grain bin winches and took in the layout with one sweep. Stone hoppers above, release chutes below, narrow lane between them. Enough for a trap if timed right. He pointed. "You, wedge that hatch half open. You, knock the brake pins loose when I say." No sooner. If you drop it early, I'll nail your boots to the floor myself. No one argued. The Skaven hit the chamber in a squealing rush, flushed by the blood scent and eager after the close tunnels. They spread wider here, flooding around the broken doorframe and over the drifts of spilled grain. Slingers in the rear snapped shots between shoulders. One stone clanged off Brocky's spectacles and shattered the left lens. Another took a miner in the throat. He dropped the shovel, both hands clamping at his neck as blood pumped between his fingers in thick, dark pulses. He made a wet hissing sound and sank slowly to his knees while the others stepped around him because there was no time to mourn and nowhere else to stand. "Hold!" Dorna growled. The first Skaven reached the lane. Dorna's axe carved down and took one from collarbone through heart. Harik caved another's chest with a shield bash, hard enough to snap its spine backward. Brocky jabbed his pistol into the face of a third and fired. The shot blew fur, eye, skull and whatever wit the creature had possessed across the grain sacks behind it. Still they came. A Skaven with brass-studded leather and a snub-nosed pistol clambered atop one of the bins and fired downward into the dwarf line. The shot tore through an ironbreaker's beard and mouth, shattering jawbone in a spray of blood and white fragments. He dropped to all fours, gagging on his own teeth. Before anyone could pull him back, 3 clan rats swarmed him. One stabbed up under the breastplate. Another chewed at the torn face, biting off a strip of cheek as the dwarf still convulsed. The third hacked at the neck joint with a saw-backed knife, red mist pumping over its pores. The young miner with the shovel broke then. He screamed and charged, grief and terror making him stupid. He buried the shovel blade in one rat man's belly and nearly cut it in half. The Skaven folded around the wound, spilling loops of gut and squealing. Then 2 others seized the boy by either side of the head and dragged him down. Brocky saw his scalp peel backward under clawed fingers. Saw one eye dragged half from the socket before a blade punched into his side once, twice, 6 times in a blur. By the time Dorna reached him, he was already mostly meat. "Pins!" Brocky roared. The miners at the grain bin winches kicked loose the iron catches. The bottom hatches thundered open. A cataract of barley and hard winter wheat burst from the bins with the force of a rock slide. It slammed into the packed Skaven and buried the front ranks to the waist, then the chest. More poured over them, a grinding, suffocating flood of grain that knocked rats from their feet and rolled them shrieking across the chamber. Some vanished completely, dragged under by the sheer weight. Others clawed frantically upward only to have more grain pour into mouths and nostrils. One ratman surfaced long enough for Brocky to see both its paws at its bulging throat before Dorna buried an axe in its skull and drove it back under. The room became chaos. Dwarfs hacked downward into the mounded grain wherever it twitched. Black blood soaked through the pale kernels in spreading blooms. A Skaven arm punched free of the heap and grabbed Harik's ankle. He stamped until the forearm snapped, then stamped again until the hand came off at the wrist and disappeared back into the shifting mound. "Forward," Dorna commanded, and the surviving ironbreakers trudged apace into the grain, killing as they went. They almost held it. Then the eastern wall exploded. Not breached from a doorway or corridor. Exploded. Stone blocks the size of ale casks burst inward in a hurricane of grit and broken masonry. A drilling head punched through, iron-toothed and spinning vomiting sparks. Behind it came a shower of green light and a stink like hot copper, bilge water and grave soil. The machine screamed as it bit the last of the wall away, and Skaven poured through the wound around it, shrieking triumph. Brocky stared for half a heartbeat at the warp-powered auger jutting from the shattered stone. Not just tunnelers, engineers. His stomach went cold with a professional hatred so pure it felt clean. A Skaven warlock's apprentice, draped in filthy cables and bronze coils, rode a little gantry behind the drillhead. Its muzzle was wrapped in a copper mask, and one eye had been replaced with a lens that glowed the same sickly green as the whirring power stones mounted in the engine housing. It jabbered a command. Two of the newcomers hefted globes of cracked glass stoppered with wax. "Gas!" Brocky bellowed. "Down!" The globes smashed on the stone and burst in greasy yellow clouds. The vapor rolled low at first, then billowed upward with a life of its own. A miner caught the first breath and immediately began coughing wet chunks onto his beard. Blood sprayed from his mouth. His eyes turned red, and then darker, as vessels burst across the whites. He clawed at his throat until his fingernails tore away. Another took 2 staggering steps, vomited black slime, and toppled into the grain heap where he kicked and kicked until his boots slowed. The dwarfs fell back toward the storeroom arch while the gas spread through the vault. Dorna seized the jawless ironbreaker by the straps and dragged him bodily, boots furrowing lines through the grain. Harik covered her, smashing aside lunging Skaven with his shield until a drill rat with a rotary saw fixed to one arm darted under his guard and opened his thigh to the bone. Flesh peeled away in a wet spiral. Harik went down hard, bellowing. The saw rat leapt onto him and carved again, deeper this time, spraying hot arterial blood across the bins. Brocky reached him first. He swung the hammer two-handed and flattened the saw rat's spine. The machine arm still whirred as the corpse twitched. Harik tried to stand, looked at the ruin of his leg, and knew. "Leave me," he grunted, voice gone to gravel. Dorna grabbed his gorget ring anyway. He shoved her off. "Hold the next room," he snarled. "By the ancestors, woman. That's an order. Enough." The Skaven were already coming through the gas, in a blur of shadows and glinting teeth. Harik rolled onto his good side, planted his shield before him and set his axe across the rim. Dorna looked at him one long heartbeat. Then she nodded once, sharp and final, and turned away. They fell back into the adjoining storeroom just as Harik's last stand began in the arch behind them. Brocky heard every part of it. The first shield impacts, the meaty thud of axe in flesh. A Skaven scream cut off halfway. Another, then a rising animal chorus as too many bodies piled in at once. Harik, roaring old curses, metal scraping stone. The ugly, unmistakable sound of knives working into a body from several angles. Harik's voice turning to a wordless bellow that seemed to tear itself apart in his chest. Then silence under the wet-feeding noises. Brocky did not turn. None of them did. The storeroom was long and low, crowded with casks, stacked ingots, spare chain, and crates of blasting powder marked with guild runes. Lanterns swung from hooks overhead, throwing mad shadows over the stone. It was a place made for order and inventory. In war it became a tomb with resources. Brocky's eye went at once to the powder crates, to the chain, to the old loading rails running toward the next chamber. Good. He could still work with this. But before he could speak, Dorna raised a blood-slick gauntlet, and everyone froze. From beyond the storeroom walls came scratching. Not one side, all sides. Behind the casks, beneath the floor, in the ceiling void, above the lantern hooks, thin, eager, ceaseless. The Skaven had not pursued them through the arch because they had no need. They were in the walls now. Brocky looked at the powder crates, then at the terrified faces around him, and finally at the runic lintel leading toward the upward way. Somewhere above, the Thane's council would still be arguing while the lower hold was gnawed hollow around its foundations. He picked up a crate of blasting charges and set it on the loading rail. "All right," he said, voice flat as quarried stone. "Now we make them pay for every room." Chapter 3. The Council of Cowards. The council chamber of Karak Dromzul had been cut from the mountain in an age when dwarfs believed stone itself could shame weakness. The ceiling rose in a vault of black granite, ribbed with carved runes, and the stern, bearded faces of dead kings who had never ruled this hold, but whose stony gazes seemed to judge it all the same. Pillars thick as watchtowers marched down either side of the hall, each ringed with iron bands engraved in gold leaf, now dimmed by decades of smoke. The floor was a mosaic of hammer, anvil, axe, and mountain, worked in red porphyry and green serpent stone, polished by generations of iron-nailed boots. At the far end stood the Thane's chair upon its stepped dais, not a throne in the airy human manner, but a block of ancestral stone fronted by the shields of the hold's honored dead. Above it all burned braziers of perfumed coal that should have filled the chamber with warmth and stately dignity. Instead, the air reeked of panic. Messengers came and went through the bronze doors at a stumbling run, boots slipping on soot tracked in from the lower halls. Their faces were grey with dust, blood-streaked tunics and beards. One had lost 2 fingers and carried the hand, wrapped in a scrap of cloak, already soaked through. Every time the doors opened, noise came with them. Horns sounding from the galleries below, the distant iron boom of closing gates, the faint and awful undernote of screaming that seemed to seep upward through the mountain itself. Still the council argued. Rorek Grudgeson stood near the center table, with both fists braced on its carved edge, his beard bound in silver rings that trembled with each barked word. He was old even by dwarf measure, broad in the shoulder still, but gone soft around the waist, his cheeks mottled with broken veins and furnace heat. One eye filmed white, the other hot with fury. "I will not have half the hold drowned and blasted on the word of soot-faced tunnel runners," he thundered. "There are laws for the sealing of inhabited levels. There are procedures. There are votes." "Votes?" snapped Varric Coalbeard. The mine master's voice was raw as a rasp, his hands black to the wrists with stone dust. His left sleeve darkened where someone else's blood had dried into it. "Down below they're not taking votes, Rorek. They're taking throats," the old councillor rounded on him. "And whose fault is the breach if not the guild's? Whose men neglected the old shafts? Whose crews ignored the sink lines and tremors?" Varric bared his teeth. "Mine sent reports for 6 winters. 6. Your ledgers called the repairs non-essential." Rorek jabbed a thick finger at him. "Because we had no proof?" At that, a messenger staggered through the doors and nearly fell. He was little more than a beard under a layer of white dust, one side of his face blistered and peeling from heat. He made it 3 limping steps into the chamber before his knees failed. 2 guards caught him under the arms. "Speak, Thane," Orsig Damahol said. The Thane sat forward, in the stone chair, gauntlets clenched on its armrests, hard enough to make the tendons in his forearms stand out. He was not an old dwarf, but care and years of keeping a poor hold alive had carved hard lines around his mouth. His mail shirt was on beneath his council robes. There was ash on his boots. He had expected trouble the way a good ruler always did, but not this, never this. He had spent the last hour listening to half-truths, accusations, and protocols, while his hold bled into the lower stones. The messenger coughed and spat something black onto the mosaic floor. Lower works lost. Lord, hiraspet. Vent road gone. Pump chamber destroyed. Skaven in the grain vaults and machine passages. Iron breakers falling back room by room. His eyes flicked around the chamber, fever-bright and furious. Engineer Halgrimson requests powder, drake fire, reinforcements, and leave to collapse the old junctions. Says the rats aren't raiding. Says they're driving for the central lift shafts. Silence followed, but not the useful kind. It was the silence of proud men measuring how much blame they could shift before speaking again. Then Rorek snorted. One engineer's fear is not strategy. The messenger made a sound then, not quite a laugh, and not quite a sob. Fear, he said. I saw Baron Skullsplitter, cooked alive in his own armor. I saw Harek Mudderson, fighting on one leg, while rats climbed into his guts. I smelled beard and flesh burning together till I thought I'd vomit my lungs out. Call it what you like, councillor. Down there it has teeth. He swayed where he knelt. A guard tried to steady him, and drew back when his fingers came away slick with blood leaking from somewhere beneath the messenger's mail. Orsic rose. The chair legs grated on the dais behind him. It was a small sound, but it cut through the chamber like an axe through rotten wood. Enough, the Thane said. For a heartbeat, even Rorek shut his mouth. Orsic descended one step from the dais. Not all the way, but enough that he no longer looked like a ruler carved above his people. He looked like a warrior deciding where to plant his feet. What stands between the lower breach and the lift shafts? He asked. Varric answered at once. The old magazine corridors, Lord. Spare chain stores. The western loading rooms. Then the bellows halls. And if the rats reach the bellows, smoke in the upper furnaces, fire in the ductwork, panic. Then they come through anywhere the stone is thinnest. The Thane looked to the captain of his hall guard. How many can you muster now? 200, ready, in armor. Another score in 10 minutes. More if you strip the gatewatch. Rorek found his voice again, oily with outrage. Strip the gatewatch, while the outer halls remain unsecured? Madness. We do not know this is the main thrust. This may be exactly what the vermin want to pull strength inward, while Confederates strike from without. Varric laughed in his face, a hard, dead sound. Listen to yourself. The mountain is bleeding beneath your boots and you're frightened of shadows outside. Rorek shoved him. Varric shoved back. The guards stepped in, too late. The two councillors crashed into the center table, sending marker stones and old maps skidding. Rorek swung first. A clumsy, angry blow. Varric ducked under it and drove his forehead into the elder's nose. Cartilage crunched. Rorek reeled, blood pumping over his mustache, and came back with a snarl wholly stripped of dignity. He clawed for Varric's beard rings, got a fistful, and the two of them went down amid overturned benches like common tavern drunks, while the dead kings looked on in stone contempt. Orsic did not shout. He stepped down the last stair, walked to the struggling pair, and kicked the table into them. The slab edge struck Rorik in the ribs with a noise like a mallet hitting wet timber. He rolled away gasping. Varric staggered clear with blood in his beard and one eye swelling. The Thane's voice came out low and flat. "Any dwarf who spills a brother's blood in this chamber, while Skaven crawl our halls, will answer to me before the ancestors." No one moved. That was when the bells began. Not the ordered clang of a signal chain, not the measured toll of fire or gate call. These were alarm bells rung out of rhythm by panicked hands somewhere in the middle levels, fast and frantic and wrong. They were joined a heartbeat later by shouting from beyond the bronze doors. Not formal reports. Fear. A second messenger burst in without waiting. He was a younger dwarf, his helm gone, his beard half seared and clotted with blood that was not entirely his own. "Rats in the west stair." "Lord," he did not finish. Something shot through the gap before the doors could close. A sling stone or a pistol shot, too fast to mark. It punched through the back of his neck and burst from the front in a spray of blood, gristle, and shattered vertebrae. He toppled forward almost boneless, arterial blood fountaining over the mosaic. Behind him, through the widening door, came a wash of noise, like a butcher's yard flung open at once, screaming, squealing, steel striking stone. The Skaven had reached the middle halls. Guards slammed the doors shut with their shoulders as the Thane snatched the fallen messenger's axe from his belt. Bolts shot home. A heartbeat later, the bronze boomed under impact from the other side. Once, twice, again. Claws scraped metal. Thin screeches leaked through the seams like steam from a bad valve. Rorik was still on the floor, one hand to his side, blood from his broken nose soaking into his moustache. "This is impossible," he whispered. Varric stared at him with open hatred. "No, this is the bill coming due. Far below, in the storerooms and side passages under the council's boots, Brocky Hallgrimsson was paying it in flesh. The loading room had become a murder machine. He had set the powder crates on the old iron rails used to move munitions carts between store chambers, chained casks together into a low breastwork, and knocked loose the overhead hoist hooks with a few expert blows. So they hung, swaying above the main approaches. Behind him, the surviving miners and ironbreakers worked with the numb obedience of men too deep in terror to argue. Hands passed powder, chain, lamp oil, iron ingots. Faces were streaked with soot, blood, and the weird blankness that comes when a mind stops understanding the number of dead. The scratching in the walls thickened to a frenzy. Then, the first stones punched inward. A Skaven face appeared between split blocks, one eye bulging around the chisel head it had wedged through. Brocky drove a spike into that eye up to the knuckles. The creature shrieked and vanished backward, but a second later the entire section of wall caved in and the rats came through in a torrent. "Loose!" Brocky shouted. The first powder cart went roaring down the rail. He had lashed lanterns to its front and packed the bed with blasting charges, bent nails and broken chain links. It struck the breech mouth and detonated in a blossom of fire and iron. The blast turned the nearest Skaven inside out. One disappeared from the waist down, upper body spinning away in a red fan of intestines and black blood. Another had both arms stripped off at the shoulder by chain fragments and stood gawping at the stumps before a second impact knocked it flat. Bits of fur and meat slapped wetly against the ceiling, the room filled with dust and shrieking. Brocky was already hauling the second cart into place. Dorna stood atop a stack of ingot crates, like an idol of war, face hidden by her darkened helm, axe wet to the haft, every swing killed. She split a rat-man from scalp to nose so deep the blade lodged between its collarbones, tore it free, and buried it in the next skull before the first body had finished collapsing. When one leapt high at her with a hooked blade, she caught it by the throat in her valve wheel hand and drove its back onto the corner of a crate until the spine snapped. She hurled the corpse into two more and jumped down into the gap, boots hitting blood-slick stone with enough force to splash red up her greaves. A wounded miner beside the rail fumbled a fuse and got his fingers too close to the powder flash. Fire took the hand at once. Skin blackened, split, and curled from the bone as he screamed. Brocky shoved him aside, jammed the torch under the next fuse himself, and kicked the cart forward just as a Skaven with a serrated spear lunged in from the side. The point ripped through Brocky's sleeve and opened his forearm from wrist to elbow. Flesh parted. Blood ran hot to his fingertips. He did not even feel it properly until he caved the rat-man's jaw in with his hammer and saw his own blood spraying after the backswing. The second detonation blew out half the room's remaining lamps and sent a crate of blasting powder tumbling open. Black grains spilled across the floor and mixed with the blood in greasy clumps. Bad. Very bad. From beyond the shattered wall came the howl of the warp drill again, closer now, chewing through another partition somewhere behind them. They were being flanked in layers. "Back to the chain store," Dorna roared. They withdrew under pressure, every step purchased with hacking steel. One miner caught a Skaven thrust in the belly and was pinned to a cask. He looked down at the blade as though puzzled. Then another rat climbed his chest and opened his throat with its teeth. Blood pumped over both of them. Dorna took their heads in one stroke and moved on. The chain store was a narrower chamber, stacked floor to ceiling with coils of black iron thick as wrists. Here the fight became close enough to smell breath. Skaven swarmed over the stacks, dropping from above in squealing arcs. One landed on an ironbreaker's shoulders and stabbed both claws through the vision slits of his helm. The dwarf's scream came out gargled and animal. He reeled blind into the wall while the rat rode him, sawing at his neck joint until a hot sheet of blood ran down the breastplate. Another ironbreaker seized the Skaven by the tail, tore it free, and smashed its head against a chain post until the skull burst like rotten fruit. Brocky hacked through a support rope and sent a cascade of iron links crashing down over a knot of attackers. The chains flattened 3 Skaven outright, pulping limbs and ribs. A fourth was trapped from the waist down, pawing and shrieking while Dorna stomped its head to paste inside its hood. Then gas rolled under the doorway. Not much, just a yellow thread at first, creeping along the floor like swamp mist. Brocky smelled it, and his guts clenched. "Rags over face," he shouted. "Now!" They tied beard cloths and torn sleeves over nose and mouth. Too slow for 2 of the miners. Both inhaled before the warning fully landed. One began coughing blood immediately. The other retched so hard his guts seemed to turn inside him. He staggered into the wall, left both palms there, and slid down, leaving red handprints that ended in finger grooves as his nails dragged. His lungs drowned in him before anyone could drag him clear. Brocky peered over the chain stacks and saw what he had feared, A low vent hole punched through the adjoining masonry, yellow vapor, pumping from a copper hose, shoved through from the far side. Clever, cowardly, very Skaven. He loaded his last pistol, with hands made clumsy by blood and exhaustion, took aim at the hose mouth and fired. The shot hit true. The copper line burst, whipping wildly. Gas flooded back the way it had come. Beyond the wall rose a delirious chorus of Skaven squeals, turning at once from triumph to panic. Brockie allowed himself one savage grin. Then the ceiling came down in the next room. Stone cracked overhead with a deep mountain groan. Dust burst from the joints. Every dwarf in the chain store froze for that single fatal fraction of a second. The drill breached through the roof beams in a shower of broken rock and green sparks, its iron snout descending like the beak of some metal carrion beast. Skaven dropped with it from the hole above, some leaping clear, others simply falling with knives out. One landed on a miner and drove both of them flat. Another hit the floor wrong, snapped a leg, and was trampled by its own kin before it could rise. Donna met the breach head-on, because there was no one else to do it. She climbed the chain stacks 2 steps at a time, launched herself into the falling dust, and slammed shoulder first into the first Skaven coming through the ceiling gap. They went down together in a rain of stones. She rose first, visor dented, and chopped left to right. The blade took one attacker across the belly so deeply the upper body folded over the lower. A second thrust caught her in the side where the warp fire had already weakened the plate. Metal shrieked. The point punched through a finger's depth. She turned into the blow, trapping the blade, and split the rat-man's face to the teeth. All around her, the room dissolved into separate little butcheries. Harrick's surviving shield brother lost his footing on a coil of chain and went to one knee, just as a Skaven globe burst at his feet. Not poison this time, but fire. Green flames splashed up his legs, clung to him, crawled under the armor seams. He howled and tore at his own cuisses, while the fire ate through leather and skin. By the time he toppled, his boots had fused to his calves. 2 rats fell on him anyway, stabbing through the steaming gaps. Brockie reached the base of the drill support and saw the power stone assembly bolted under it, glowing with that same foul green pulse. Unstable, overfed, a bad design. He loved it instantly for how it might die. "Dorna!" he shouted. "Clear the supports!" She did not answer in words. She drove her axe into a Skaven collarbone, ripped it free, and bodied 3 more away from the machine with sheer furious weight. Brockie slid through blood and rubble to the underside of the frame, hammered 2 blasting charges into the warped mounting brackets, and lit both fuses off the spill lantern hanging from the drill rig. He ran. The explosion punched the world white. The drill support blew sideways. One leg snapped and scythed through a knot of Skaven, taking heads and shoulders with it in a spray of black-red arcs. The glowing power stone assembly tore loose, smashed against the far wall and ruptured. Green fire belched outward in a spherical pulse. Stone vitrified. Fur ignited. A Skaven warlock's apprentice near the blast had time to rear back and open its mouth before the fire stripped flesh from its skull and left the bones glowing through a sheath of cinder. The chain store collapsed into a screaming ruin. When the dust settled enough to breathe, Brockie found himself on one knee, under a bent rack, ears ringing, beard full of powdered mortar. Dorna was standing somehow, though blood ran dark from under her arm and her left pauldron hung in 2 pieces. Of the miners, 4 still moved. Of the ironbreakers, 3. And through the smoke, from somewhere beyond the broken chambers, came the sound of horns. Dwarfen horns this time. Not the confused alarms of panicked halls, but a real call, deep, ordered, wrathful. Above, finally, the Thane had made his choice. Brocky hauled himself upright, chest burning. "About cursed time," he muttered. But even as the horns rolled through the stone, the scratching continued in the walls around them, patient and hungry, and every dwarf in that ruined chamber knew the truth of it. The council's courage had come late, and the hold had already paid for every minute in blood. Chapter 4. Grudge Fire. The horns of Karak Dromzul did not sound like hope. They sounded like judgment. The notes came rolling down the mountain's inner arteries in slow, iron-throated waves that shook dust from lintels and set cracked lantern glass trembling in its fittings. Deep calls, old calls, the kind used when a hold stopped pretending it was under threat and admitted, at last, that it was at war for its own heart. Their echo moved through the ruined lower levels and over the dead in storerooms, grain vaults, collapsed machine halls and blood-slick passages where Skaven and dwarf lay tangled together in butchers' heaps. Brocky Halgrimson heard them in the shattered chain store and spat a gob of black dust and blood onto the floor. "Late," he said. His voice was raw as torn leather. The explosion that had crippled the warp drill had half ruined the chamber. One wall bulged inward beneath a web of fractures. A beam of ancient black pine had come down across the loading arch and pinned 3 Skaven beneath it, all still alive, their hindquarters crushed flat, their clawed hands digging madly at the stone while they shrieked for help that would never come. One of the surviving miners, too shocked to do otherwise, had planted his boot on one ratman's head and was just standing there, staring while the creature snapped uselessly at the air. Donna Kragsdottir leaned on her axe a moment longer than Brocky liked. Her armor was a charnel exhibit, one pauldron gone, breastplate scarred by warp fire and punctured under the arm where a blade had slipped in. Blood had clotted black along her flank and down the inside of one greave. The visor of her helm had been bent in the last blast. One eye slot was half crushed, turning her face into a squinting iron death mask. Yet when she pushed off the axe and straightened, she still looked harder than the stone around her. "How many?" Brocky asked. She looked over what remained. 3 iron breakers on their feet, counting herself. 4 miners, one coughing blood into his beard cloth, one with his left hand burned to a black claw, one little more than a limping boy with a split scalp and empty eyes. 7 dwarfs besides Brocky. That was all that stood between the belly of the hold and the things chewing through it. "Enough," Donna said. It was a lie, and that was exactly why he liked her. Another horn call rolled down from above. This time it was joined by the distant crash of organized fighting somewhere in the middle halls. Shield beats, shouted commands, the ring of dwarf steel in ranks. The Thane had finally loosed the guard and sounded the full muster. Above, perhaps, there was still a chance to hold the lift shafts and central galleries. Below, there was only work. Brocky crouched beside the mangled remains of the Skaven drill rig and pried at its half-molten frame with his wrench. The Power Stone assembly had burst, but not wholly. One fist-sized shard still pulsed among the wreckage, sick green and angry as a trapped eye. Warp stone. Filthy, unnatural, useful. He hated touching it even through gauntlets. It made the hairs on his wrists stand and left a bitter taste crawling up the back of his tongue. He wrapped it in oilcloth anyway and stuffed it into his satchel beside the last of the blasting charges. Dorna watched him. "That wise?" "No," Brocky said, "but neither is letting rats blow our mountain open." He rose and turned toward the breach the drill had opened. Beyond it lay old junctions abandoned generations ago, mapeless in places, half-sealed in others, ventilation cuts, powder magazines, dead-end hallways, sink shafts, and forgotten survey tunnels. Bad ground, perfect ground for Skaven. Worse, Brocky could feel the draft coming through there warm, carrying oil smoke and the copper reek of bad alchemy. The enemy's real nest was close, not a mere raiding shaft, a staging point, a burrowed spearhead aimed at the hole's lungs and guts. "They came for the bellows and the magazine," he said. "If they crack both, they poison the upper halls or blast the whole lower spine apart." Dorna nodded once. "Then we kill them there. No speeches, no oaths, only the shape of duty, hard and inevitable." They left the chain store behind, stepping over the dead as if crossing uneven paving. One of the half-crushed Skaven under the beam reached for Brocky's boot and made a desperate keening noise. Brocky planted his hammer squarely on its snout and pressed until bone burst and the sound stopped. The passage beyond the drill breach sloped down through torn rock and old support ribs blackened by age. Here the hold showed its oldest bones. Tool marks from dead centuries crossed the walls beneath newer, more frantic scratches where Skaven claws and picks had widened forgotten seams. The air was hot and wet. Thin threads of steam hissed from cracked stone. Somewhere below, machinery snarled and coughed in an irregular pulse. The first body they found was a dwarf mason from the lower repair gangs, or what was left of him. He had been nailed to the wall with mining spikes through both forearms and under the chin, pinning the head at an obscene upward angle. His belly had been opened from sternum to belt, and his entrails hung in loops over his boots. The cavity was empty where the liver should have been. His face had been flensed in strips, cheeks peeled back to bare teeth and jawbone in a grin too hideous to be called one. Someone had carved a crude Skaven rune into his chest with a dozen hurried cuts. The limping boy miner gagged and turned away. Dorna put the axe in the corpse's heart without comment and pulled it free. Further on, the tunnels widened into an old survey hub, broken by intersecting shafts. Lantern cages had been nailed up by Skaven hands, their glass smeared with soot so the light came out sickly and bruised. Rusted rails ran through the center toward a larger chamber ahead. On those rails sat a line of ore carts loaded not with ore but corpses, dwarfs and Skaven together, some whole, some not. Brocky saw severed heads in one cart, a heap of arms in another, one little stack of children's shoes half buried beneath a spill of bloody cloth. The miners stopped walking. Brocky did not. He moved forward with his jaw clenched so hard the hinges ached. This, more than the fighting, more than the burrowed cunning of the enemy, made something ancient and murderous wake up in him. Not fear, not fury in the hot human way. Something colder, ledger deep, the kind of wrath dwarfs preserved for generations. At the far end of the hub, the rails descended into the old lower magazine. That chamber had once stored black powder, blasting charges, and spare bellows fittings for the deep forges. Now it had become the Skaven's heart nest. The great stone vault was alive with movement and noise. Timber scaffolds climbed the walls, lashed together from looted support beams. Copper pipes snaked between furnace-like contraptions that belched green flame. Powder kegs marked with Dwarf Guild runes lay split open beside Skaven bomb racks. Clan rats swarmed over platforms and ladders, while robed engineers with brass masks screeched orders from gantries. At the center of it all rose a monstrous pumping engine cobbled from stolen dwarf machinery and Skaven warp tech. Twin bellows feeding some venomous distillery, all of it hammering and glowing and venting clouds of greasy yellow vapor up into the shaftwork overhead. And there, on an elevated scaffold wrapped in dangling cables and sparking coils, stood the mastermind of it, Scritch Sparkbite. Brocky had never seen the creature before, but he knew the type instantly. A warlock engineer, thin even for Skaven, draped in patchwork armor and insulated leather, one arm replaced from elbow down, with a crackling apparatus of copper talons and glass tubes, through which green light pulsed like infected blood. A magnifying lens covered one eye. The other was red, feverish, and full of delighted contempt as it looked down over its murder works. Below the scaffold, chained to winch posts, knelt half a dozen dwarf prisoners stripped to their undershirts, alive, for the moment. One of the Skaven engineers walked along the line with a hooked knife and opened one captive from shoulder to spine as casually as a cook, filleting a fish. The dwarf screamed once, then the Skaven shoved him into the intake trough of the distillery. Machinery caught, bones snapped, blood sprayed in an arterial fan across the flywheel housing and vanished into the pumping mechanism. Brocky felt every muscle in his body go rigid. Beside him, Dorna's breath came slow through a helm grill. "No more falling back," she said. "No," Brocky said. "No more." There was no room for finesse, no time for a perfect trap. The magazine itself was the answer. Powder, pressure, bad Skaven engineering. Enough force here to seal half the lower workings if lit properly. Enough to bury the assault shaft and everyone in it. Maybe enough to save the hold. Maybe. Brocky knelt and set out what remained. 4 blasting charges, 2 casks of black powder the miners had dragged this far, the wrapped warpstone shard, 3 lengths of fuse, 1 lantern, and the engineer's professional certainty that if he got the ratios wrong, they would all die for nothing. "Dorna," he said, never taking his eyes off the chamber, "I can break the nest, but I need the bellows overfed and the powder train lit near the base. That means close work. Then you do your close work." She glanced back at the survivors. "We'll keep the filth off you." The limp boy swallowed. That's hundreds." Dorna turned her ruined helm toward him. "Aye, and that was all." They struck like a blasting cap. The first cart went down the rail, loaded with a powder cask, and the broken warpstone shard jammed into its center. Brocky lit the fuse and kicked it hard. The cart screamed downhill, sparks jumping from its axles. For one suspended instant, the Skaven below did not understand what they were seeing. Then the cart hit a support column at the edge of the nest and burst. Green and orange fire punched upward in a twisting pillar. The support shattered. One whole scaffold side collapsed, hurling Skaven through the air like kicked vermin. A warlock's apprentice struck the stone floor head first and burst open at the neck. Another vanished under falling timber, and reappeared only as limbs and a tail protruding from the wreckage. The blast tore open a gas line, and yellow vapor whooshed across the chamber, igniting in patches where flames licked it. Before the echoes died, Dorna and the Ironbreakers were already charging. They hit the first rank of clan rats at the magazine threshold with such force that shields and bodies flew apart together. Dorna's axe took a Skaven boss through the mouth and out the base of the skull, spraying teeth and dark brain matter over the tracks. To her right, an Ironbreaker smashed his shield into a Ratman's chest until ribs punched out through its back like snapped cage bars. The burned-handed miner swung a chain hook in great mad arcs, catching one Skaven under the jaw and tearing most of its face away as it spun off the platform edge. Brocky went low under the wider fight, sprinting for the pumping engine, with satchel bouncing against his hip. A clan rat lunged from behind a powder keg, and he rammed the wrench into its eye, felt the tool sink deep, then yanked it sideways so the creature's snout came apart in a stringy burst. Another seized his arm with both paws and bit through leather to the meat beneath. Brocky hammered down on its spine until vertebrae snapped like kindling. All around him the chamber became a slaughterhouse in motion. The prisoners screamed as the fighting crashed among them. One dwarf tore loose a chain pin with desperate strength and strangled a Skaven guard with the dangling length, while his own open back spilled blood down his spine. Another got halfway free before a Globadier's glass bomb shattered at his feet. Green fire clung to his legs and ate upward. He did not stop clawing at the chain until his hands were bone. Dorna climbed the central ramp towards Scritch Sparkbite through a rain of sling stones and pistol shots. One struck her helm and snapped her head sideways. Another found the gap at her already damaged side and drove in. She grunted, staggered, kept going. A pair of clan rats met her with hooked spears. She caught one shaft under her arm, ripped the wielder bodily off the platform, then chopped the other through hip and spine, so the upper half of the body slid from the lower and toppled twitching down the stairs. Scritch shrieked at her and thrust out his metal claw. A lance of green lightning cracked from the apparatus and struck the Ironbreaker beside her, square in the chest. Armor burst open. For a heartbeat the dwarf stood outlined in sick light, skeleton visible beneath flesh. Then his torso exploded outward in a shower of cooked organs and red-black slurry that drenched the steps. Dorna came through the spray without slowing. Below, Brocky reached the engine base. The pumping rig was even uglier up close. Stolen bellows pistoned under chain drive, feeding compressed gas into copper retorts packed around warp-heated cores. Dwarf powder kegs had been wired into the system as boosters. Insane, effective, fragile. He saw exactly where to kill it. He jammed charges into the drive housing, under the pressure manifold, at the bellows hinge, and finally into the powder train feeding the retorts. The last fuse line he spooled directly beneath the engine's spine, hands slick with blood, vision blurring from smoke and exhaustion. A shadow fell over him. He turned as Vreek Nortail, the Skaven battle leader, dropped from a side catwalk with a notched cleaver in one paw and a rusted pistol in the other. The rat's muzzle was scarred, one ear torn off, armor scavenged from 3 different corpses, clever yellow eyes fixed on the fuses. "Mine, mine," it hissed and fired. The shot took Brocky high in the shoulder and spun him into the engine housing. Pain exploded down his arm, hot and white and immediate. Before he could right himself, Vreek was on him, clawing, slashing, biting. The cleaver hacked through Brocky's beard braids and bit into the mail at his neck. He caught the Skaven wrist in both hands, and they crashed together against the bellows frame, snarling like animals. Vreek's breath stank of carrion. Its claws raked Brocky's burned cheek and peeled skin away in strips. Brocky headbutted it. Once, twice. On the third strike, the Skaven's lens eye cracked. Green fluid burst across Brocky's face. Vreek shrieked and bit him through the palm. Brocky roared back, jammed his thumb into the ruined eye socket, and pushed until he felt something rupture behind it. The Skaven convulsed. Brocky seized the wrench from his belt and drove it up under the creature's jaw with both hands. The point punched into the skull and stuck there. Vreek's hind legs hammered the floor, then slowed. Brocky let the corpse slide off him and fumbled for the fuse. Above, Dorna met Scritch Sparkbite on the top scaffold. The Warlock engineer was no warrior. It fought like a cornered thing, wild, shrieking, vicious with tools rather than skill. Its copper claw spat lightning and hooked for joints. Its free paw slashed with a scalpel blade that hummed with green fire. Dorna took one cut across the gorget, and sparks spat from the runes. She answered with an axe stroke that tore through railing and nearly took the creature's legs. Scritch bounded sideways, tail lashing, and jabbed the claw into the side wound beneath her arm. Energy discharged. Dorna's whole frame locked. Smoke curled from under her mail. The stench of scorched flesh burst into the air. Scritch squealed in triumph. Then Dorna dropped her axe, seized the crackling claw in both gauntlets, and simply dragged the creature close enough to headbutt. The bent visor of her helm smashed its snout flat. Bone punched through skin. She did it again, driving the face into itself until the lens eye burst and teeth sprayed. Scritch flailed with the scalpel, slicing through one of her beard rings, but Dorna had the claw trapped and could not be shaken. She roared a deep old bear sound and heaved the Skaven bodily over the scaffold rail. The Warlock fell screaming through smoke and fire and landed back first on the rotating flywheel of its own engine. The machine caught it. Brocky saw the body fold, spine snapping around the turning iron, then disappear limb by limb beneath the gears in a fountain of blood, fur, and crushed organs. "Brocky!" Dorna shouted from above. He had the fuse in hand. So did the nearest Skaven. A surviving globadier, face burned to one side and one paw hanging by tendons, lunged from the fumes and sank a hooked blade into the fuse line halfway between Brocky and the charges. The cord parted. For one frozen instant, Brocky stared at it. Then the truth settled, calm and merciless. No time to splice. No time to relay. No time for anything except a hand on the source. Dorna saw it too, even from the scaffold, even through the smoke. Their eyes met across the nest. There was 1,000 things a human might have said then. Regrets, farewells, pleas. Dwarfs were better than that. Harder. Dorna gave him one nod. Brocky bared his teeth through blood and soot and returned it. He snatched up a fallen lantern, smashed it against the powder spill at the engine base, and drove his gauntleted fist straight into the burning train to hold the fire there. The world did not explode at once. First, there was a hiss, then a deep gulping thump as the bellows inhaled flame. Then every charge he had set found its purpose. The engine tore itself apart. Pressure burst the manifold in a screaming jet of fire and shrapnel. The powder kegs went a breath later, kicking the chamber floor up in slabs. Bellows ruptured. Gas lines became flamethrowers. The whole Skaven nest blossomed outward in layered detonations, orange and green and white hot at the core. Brocky saw 100 brief impossible details in that instant. Clan rats stripped to skeletons in the flare, Dorna hurling herself from the collapsing scaffold, prisoners and guards alike thrown like dolls, copper pipes curling in the heat, the mountain ceiling cracking open. Then the lower hold came down, stone folded, pillars burst, entire galleries sheared away in roaring curtains of rubble. The assault shaft collapsed on itself from top to bottom, swallowing Skaven machines. Dead, living, fire, and poison under thousands of tons of mountain. The shock wave ripped through the old workings and blew dust out of the stair mouths 3 levels above. In the middle halls, Thane Orsic Damahall and his guard felt the floor buck and thought for one mad heartbeat that the mountain itself had decided to die. Then came the backdraft, hot and stinking, followed by silence. Not true silence, but close enough that every surviving dwarf in Karak Dromzul felt it like a hand around the throat. Hours later, when the last fighting in the middle halls had been beaten down, and the surviving Skaven hunted from the breached passages, the Thane came to the edge of the collapse. The lower stairs ended in a mountain of broken stone, splintered beams and black smoke still leaking from the cracks. Dead rats were wedged everywhere in it, burned, crushed or half-buried. Here and there a dwarf hand or helm showed among the rubble before masons gently covered them. The air smelled of dust, old blood, burned powder, and the sour aftertaste of warp fire. No one spoke for a long time. Dorna Kragsdotter was found near the top of the fall beneath a slab of cracked granite, still breathing through blood. They dragged her free with chains and 6 grim-faced guards. Her body was broken in 3 places, 1 leg ruined, half her beard burned away, but her heart still hammered like a forge. When they told her the breach was sealed, she closed her eyes once and only once. Brocky Halgrimsson was not found. The Thane stood before the rubble with soot on his face, and the council behind him, silent now, their arguments buried under the dead they had purchased with delay. Rorik Grudgeson could not meet anyone's eyes. Varric Coldbeard stood, with his fists clenched so tight blood seeped from his palms where his nails had cut them. At last Orsic drew his dagger, scored a line into the stone of the nearest pillar, and spoke into the smoky dark below. "Let this grudge be written," he said, "against the Ratkin, against cowardice, against delay, against every life bought too dearly here." His voice did not shake. Behind him, masons began sealing the lower stairs with fitted blocks of black granite. Hammer on chisel, stone on stone. Each blow rang through the wounded hold like a funeral bell. When the last course was nearly set, one of the youngest masons paused and looked back over his shoulder, face suddenly pale. From somewhere beyond the fresh wall, deep under the mountain, came a faint, metallic tapping. Not frantic, not random, measured, as if some stubborn soul were still at work below. Hammer striking stone in the dark,